The air is thick with tension. Smoke curls above the silent hills. The first rays of sunlight creep over the jagged ridgelines of Okinawa, bathing the battlefield in a cold, metallic glow. There is no birdsong, only the low, ominous rumble of engines, the clatter of boots, and the deep, steady breath of men waiting for war. April 1st, 1945. The largest amphibious assault in the Pacific Theater has begun. The United States 10th Army, over 183,000 strong, lands on the shores of Okinawa. Hidden within the island's labyrinth of coral ridges and limestone caves lies the Imperial Japanese 32nd Army, grimly prepared for what they know will be their final stand. But something is off. By all logic, the Japanese soldiers were ready for battle. Many had trained for years in defensive warfare. They knew the terrain, they had built their fortifications, and their spirit had not broken. So why, in the opening days of the battle, did their resistance falter so quickly? Why did even seasoned Japanese commanders express shock at the speed and ferocity of the American advance? Historians often point to poor logistics, strategic miscalculations, or food shortages. Others say it was the inevitable collapse of an overstretched empire. But those explanations, while true, overlook a quieter, more terrifying truth. From behind every thicket, every ridge, and every machine gunner's nest, the Americans unleashed an almost inhuman force. An industrial storm of lead and fire powered by two weapons that would redefine battlefield dominance. The M1919 Browning and its bigger, thunderous sibling, the M250 caliber Browning machine gun. These were not just weapons, they were instruments of overwhelming suppression. The way they poured bullets into the battlefield was something no Japanese soldier had prepared for, no matter how disciplined, no matter how brave. The Battle of Okinawa was not only a clash of empires, it was a demonstration of how machinery, firepower, and relentless industrial capacity could unravel even the most hardened defenses. So the question remains, how did these two American machine guns, the M1919 and the M2 Browning,
long before the bullets flew across Okinawa's hills,
the war was already being fought on the assembly lines of Detroit and the mountains of Honshu. The soldiers were ready, but it was their weapons, their steel companions, that would determine who survived and who didn't. Two weapons, two worlds. The American arsenal arrived in Okinawa with two defining instruments of firepower: the M1919 Browning 30 caliber machine gun and its larger cousin, the M2 Browning 50 caliber heavy machine gun, both born from the mind of firearms genius John Moses Browning. The M1919 was a belt-fed air-cooled weapon that could deliver up to 500 rounds per minute. It was light enough to be mounted on tripods, jeeps, and even carried in pieces by infantry squads. It had been battle-tested across North Africa, Europe, and now stood ready for its final Pacific campaign. Its big brother, the M2, was a monster, firing 50 caliber rounds capable of punching through light armor, concrete, and even aircraft. The M2 wasn't just a machine gun, it was battlefield thunder in steel form. Mounted on tanks, bunkers, and defensive positions, it provided firepower that could turn an entire hillside into a storm of metal. When the M2 speaks, one Marine said, the battlefield listens. Faces behind the firepower. But guns don't fight wars alone. People do. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, a 26-year-old Japanese officer from Osaka, led a machine gun section stationed in the hills overlooking the southern sector of Okinawa. He and his men were armed with the Type 99 light machine gun, a reliable, gas-operated weapon that fired the standard 7.7mm round. Though decent in design, the Type
This area,
99 was limited
designated
by
as
its
Sector Gamma,
30-round
will be our
magazine,
primary
and more
insertion point.
critically, by Japan's growing shortages of ammunition and spare parts. Meanwhile, on the other side of the island, Corporal Richard O'Brien manned a 50 caliber M2 from his entrenched position near Kakazu Ridge. A steelworker from Pittsburgh before the war, O'Brien knew machinery. He cleaned his weapon daily,
men,
adjusted
listen
its
up.
headspace
We've got our
meticulously, and had memorized every part blindfolded. "This thing ain't just a gun," he once said. Firepower versus fragility. The Type 92 had a reputation. Deadly, accurate, but fragile. It required a team to operate in constant maintenance. In the mud and chaos of trench warfare, even a small malfunction could be fatal. American machine guns, by contrast, were built for abuse. The M1919's air-cooled barrel could overheat, but with the right crew and rhythm, it could sustain suppressive fire for hours. The M2 was even more forgiving. Its thick barrel and design allowed for extended use with minimal failure. For Japanese soldiers like Tanaka and Watanabe, every round counted. Ammunition had to be carried by hand, often through enemy fire. Spare barrels were limited. Even cleaning kits were scarce. In his journal, Tanaka once wrote, "Each bullet is a drop of our soul. The Americans shoot like they have oceans. We shoot as if each drop is our last." Everyday battles, beyond the guns. Beyond firepower, the fight was also against nature. Okinawa's spring rains turned bunkers into swamps. Japanese soldiers used rags to dry their weapons, buried them in oil-soaked cloth, and prayed they would fire when the moment came. Private Watanabe recalled carrying the Type 92 up a ridge for hours, only to find the barrel corroded from the humidity. When they fired their first volley, the gun jammed, and 3 of his comrades were killed before it could be cleared. Meanwhile, O'Brien's crew used spare parts shipped from ships offshore. When his M2 overheated, they swapped barrels in 30 seconds flat. When mud clogged the chamber, they flushed it with gasoline and fired again. One side fought with fire, the other fought with fatigue. But weapons are just tools. As fearsome as these machine guns were, they didn't win battles by themselves. A weapon is only as powerful as how it's used and when. So how did American machine gunners turn their firepower into battlefield dominance? How did tactics, training, and sheer coordination amplify the impact of every bullet fired? Dawn had barely broken when the first wave began. The diary entry of Private First Class Hiroshi Nakamura described that moment with chilling precision. His unit, part of a Japanese infantry company, had received orders to retake a ridge southwest of Kakazu, a strategic high ground held by American forces. They moved in silence, under cover of night. As the pale orange glow of morning stretched across the hills, a quiet stillness hung in the air. For a brief moment, they believed they had gone undetected. Then, it began. "The mountain roared," Nakamura wrote. "The very earth cracked open. It wasn't one gun, it was dozens, hundreds. Metal rain fell sideways." The M1919's choreography of death. From hidden bunkers, fortified foxholes, and sandbagged emplacements, American M1919 Browning machine guns erupted in synchronized fury. These weren't isolated bursts. This was a calculated web of firepower, laid out like a net across the battlefield. American gunners had trained for this. Each squad knew the exact angle and sector they were to cover. Overlapping fields of fire created what commanders called kill zones, areas where any movement triggered a cascade of bullets from multiple directions. "We didn't shoot to hit one man," recalled Sergeant Thomas Graves, a machine gun squad leader. "We shot to erase the space he occupied." The M1919's belt-fed design allowed crews to lay down sustained fire for minutes at a time. When one gun overheated, another picked up the slack. Barrels were swapped mid-fight. Ammunition belts flowed like rivers through the trenches. The tactic was not precision but pressure, overwhelming, relentless, mechanical pressure. However, a maze with no exit. The Japanese troops, trained for close-quarters combat and sharp ambushes, were caught in an entirely different kind of war. When one squad attempted to flank the American line through a dried creek bed, they were met with a cross-angle burst from two M1919s positioned high above on intersecting ridges. When another team tried to retreat, they unknowingly stepped into a secondary fire zone, hidden until it came alive with the metallic bark of Browning fire. It felt
Echo 3-5, requesting
Tactics of
immediate
domination.
airport. Over.
the Americans followed a doctrine that prioritized volume over precision. The battlefield was not about individual duels, but about controlling space with sound and steel. Suppressive fire wasn't just a tactic, it was a philosophy. Every of Japanese troops triggered fire, every fire team was supported by another, and then another. When the infantry advanced, they did so with the full confidence that their flanks and rear were covered by overlapping Browning emplacements. One platoon could move up, while another laid cover. If a machine gunner needed to reload, a nearby squad would shift their field of fire to cover the gap. It was coordination honed through months of training and logistics support that ensured no machine gun was ever without ammunition. Desperate response. Fatal gaps. On the Japanese side, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka ordered a counterflank. 3 soldiers crawled through a wooded thicket to attack the machine gun nest, pinning them down. They never made it. A second gun, completely hidden from their view, opened fire from an adjacent ridge. It had been silent the whole time, waiting for exactly this maneuver. These ambush reserves, silent guns placed just to trap retreat or counterattacks, were a hallmark of American defensive strategy during Okinawa. Tanaka's men fought back valiantly. Some used hand grenades, others, low on ammo, charged with bayonets. But it wasn't enough. Bravery met bullets, and bullets didn't blink. The wall that wouldn't break. For 6 hours, the firefight at Kakazu Ridge raged. The Japanese attack was repelled, not by tanks or flamethrowers, but primarily by machine gun teams executing a perfectly coordinated choreography of fire. By the end of the day, the ridgeline was littered with spent shell casings, and the earth itself had been reshaped by the volume of fire. American losses were minimal. It wasn't a battle of skill, it was a battle of systems. But even this level of dominance was only the beginning, because something bigger, much bigger, was waiting behind the next hill. The M2 Browning, 50 caliber, a weapon that didn't just suppress the enemy, it erased them. The air was thick with cordite. Smoke clung to the ground like mist, and the only movement was the faint shimmer of heat waves rising from the barrel of the M2. Around Corporal Richard O'Brien, the bodies of over 30 Japanese soldiers lay sprawled across the ridgeline. His machine gun had gone silent, not for lack of will, but because it had fired every last round. When his squad returned to recover the position, they found O'Brien slumped behind the weapon, lifeless. His hands were still gripping the grips. The barrel glowed red from the heat. But in those final moments, he had done the impossible. One man, one M2, and the firepower to hold an entire flank. The mechanics of mayhem. The M2 Browning, nicknamed Mar-Deuce, was more than just an upgraded machine gun. It was a battlefield revolution. 5th caliber rounds, each round the size of a cigar, could tear through concrete, armored vehicles, and multiple human targets with a single shot. Firing rate, 450 to 600 rounds per minute. Range, effective up to 1,800 meters. Cooling system, the M2's thick, heavy barrel dissipated heat efficiently, enabling long bursts with reduced risk of overheating. And unlike the M1919, which relied on suppressive volume, the M2 delivered shock and destruction with every squeeze of the trigger. It was not just a machine gun, it was artillery in the hands of a foot soldier. The sound that shattered nerves. To American troops, the M2 was a shield, a reliable god of war in steel form. But to Japanese soldiers, it was something else entirely. It did not sound like a gun, remembered Private Masao Watanabe. It sounded like a voice of thunder, a deep, metal voice that swallowed men whole. The M2's firing noise was distinct, deeper, slower, more guttural than any other weapon. It echoed across valleys, rolled down mountainsides, and announced death before it arrived. Japanese soldiers came to fear its sound more than air raids. In a diary entry, Corporal Takahashi wrote, "The Americans don't fight like soldiers, they fight like a factory. When the M2
From pressure
to devastation." While the M1919 laid down walls of bullets designed to pin and pressure, the M2 was a hammer. It didn't just suppress enemy movement, it cleared paths, it collapsed defenses, it opened dead zones through which American infantry could advance with confidence. During one assault on a fortified cave network, 2 M2s mounted on tripods swept the entrances, sending 50 caliber rounds through layers of rock, sandbags and flesh. No counterattack came. The defenders were already dead or too afraid to emerge. American tactics had evolved around this weapon. While the M1919 created zones of control, the M2 enforced terror. In the words of one Marine lieutenant, the M1919 was our rhythm section, the M2 was our soloist, and it only played death. The Japanese response, fear and frustration. Japanese commanders tried to adapt. They repositioned machine guns to avoid detection, used terrain to mask movement, even staged night attacks to evade the hammering bursts of M2 fire. But the results were often the same. Their own weapons, Type 99s and Type 92s, simply could not match the power, range, or durability. Worse still, many were falling apart. "Our machine guns are rusting," wrote Lieutenant Tanaka. "The barrels swell in the rain. The bolts jam in the dust. The Americans fire for hours. We pray our guns last a minute." Maintenance became a nightmare. Ammunition was rationed. Soldiers carried weapons they could not trust and faced enemies whose weapons never seemed to fail. The nightmare takes form. With every M2 that fired, a message was sent. "We are here. We are endless. You cannot escape." It wasn't just about killing, it was about breaking the will to fight. And by late April 1945, Japanese morale was visibly cracking. They were no longer just battling soldiers. They were battling machines, factories, and supply lines that delivered terror on demand. But even the best weapon needs bullets. As powerful as the M2 was, it still required something the Japanese couldn't afford to lose: ammunition. And soon, the next stage of the war,
16 million.
That's how many 30 caliber rounds American forces fired during the Battle of Okinawa. Not over the course of the entire Pacific campaign, just in that one battle. To put that into perspective, that was more ammunition than the entire Japanese military could produce in a year. It wasn't just a difference in tactics, it was a difference in philosophy, in production, in the very nature of how each side viewed war. The American war machine. Behind every M1919 and M2 Browning on the front line, there were ships, factories, warehouses, and railways. Cargo vessels arrived daily, unloading endless crates of ammo, spare barrels, cleaning kits, and backup weapons. M-Mobile depots were constructed right on the beach, supplying
Firepower
units
didn't
within
win.
hours.
Sustained
Factories
firepower
back
did.
home ran day and night, with civilian workers in Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh churning out bullets by the millions. This system allowed American units to fire without hesitation. There was no need to conserve, no need to wait for the right moment. Firepower was no longer just a weapon, it was a strategy. Machine gun nests weren't positioned to fire when necessary. They were expected to fire constantly, to deny movement, to destroy cover, and most importantly, to wear down the enemy's will. The Japanese struggle, fighting with limits. On the other side of the battlefield, Japanese soldiers like Lieutenant Tanaka and Private Watanabe faced a cruel reality. Ammunition was limited. Entire platoons were sometimes allocated only a few hundred rounds for a multi-day engagement. Berkshire parts were non-existent. When a gun jammed or broke, there was no replacing it. Mistetics were crumbling. American naval superiority cut off supply lines. Air raids destroyed stockpiles. Terrain made resupply impossible. As a result, Japanese machine gunners were ordered to fire only when absolutely necessary. Some held their fire for hours, waiting for the perfect shot, only to be overwhelmed by a wall of American lead. "Our courage is still strong," Tanaka wrote in his final journal entry, "but courage cannot replace bullets." Doctrines in collision. The Battle of Okinawa became lessons etched in brass. Okinawa taught future military planners a harsh truth. Firepower doesn't win battles, sustained firepower does. It's not about who has the best weapon, it's about who can keep that weapon firing when the fighting lasts for days. The legacy of the M1919 and M2 Browning wasn't just in the damage they caused, but in what they represented. A logistics pipeline that never ran dry. A philosophy that war is as much about resupply as strategy. Battlefield dictated not just by valor, but by volume.
We need to
Echoes in the
reevaluate our
age of
deployment
drones and data. Fast forward to today. The rifles may be smaller, the weapons smarter, but the question remains, can you fight a war without the logistics to support it? In the age of 4.0 warfare, with drones, AI, and satellite-guided munitions, firepower still depends on supply. Drones need batteries. Lasers need cooling systems. Precision bombs need chips. And all of them need logistics, just like the Browning gunners did in Okinawa. The battlefield has changed, but the truth hasn't. You can have the best weapon in the world, but if it stops firing, it might as well be a paperweight. One battle, many truths. The American firepower advantage at Okinawa was more than a tactical win. It was a systemic triumph of doctrine, logistics, and preparation. The Japanese soldiers, despite their courage, were overwhelmed by an enemy that could keep shooting and never stop. The disparity in weapons, ammunition, and strategic thought didn't just decide Okinawa. It decided the fate of the Pacific War. But is that where the story ends? Or is there one final piece left to uncover? We've followed the echo of a gunshot from the beaches of Okinawa to the bunkers of history, with the M1919 Browning, a tool of relentless pressure. Barrett's leveled ridge, where tactics met torrents of lead. We raw might of the M2 Browning, thundering like a steel god across the battlefield. We saw how bullets alone didn't win battles. Logistics, doctrine, and psychology did. And we understood that behind every trigger pulled was a system, not just a soldier. This was never just about two machine guns. It was about how entire nations think about war, how factories, philosophies, and fears combine to decide who lives and who falls. But was firepower the only deciding factor? Now, we must ask the uncomfortable question. Was the machine gun, formidable as it was, the only reason Japan lost the Battle of Okinawa? What if Japan had matched America's industrial scale? What if they, too, could fire endlessly, repair endlessly, and field the same level of suppressive fire? Would the battlefield have balanced out? Or, what if they had invented something entirely new, some weapon or tactic that rendered the M1919 and M2 obsolete? Would history have taken a different path? What comes next? In upcoming videos, we'll explore this very possibility. We'll look at the experimental Japanese weapons developed near the end of World War II. We'll study the ideas that never made it to the battlefield, some brilliant, some desperate. Could any of them have changed the outcome? If you're curious about the Type 99, the Type 92, or even the German MG-42's influence in the Pacific, this is your chance to shape the next deep dive. Let's make history together. Comment below. Which machine gun or battlefield tactic do you want me to analyze next? Hit like if this story changed how you view modern warfare. Subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter in our exploration of World War II's most misunderstood weapons. This is more than history. This is about understanding how wars are won, not just by courage, but by systems, strategy, and silence before the storm. But is this really the whole story? Or are